This module is part of the Canadian Injury Prevention curriculum. Audio is required for an enhanced learning experience. Throughout the module, you can access the glossary by clicking the upper left-hand corner in the toolbar above the video and the resources below the video. If at any time you are confused, stuck, or need help, you can click on the upper right-hand corner in the toolbar above the video. Welcome to Social Determinants of Injury. In this module, we will cover the following topics: risk and protective factors, key determinants of injury, how social determinants of health affect injury risk, resiliency, and populations that have a higher injury risk. This module contains a glossary that can be accessed anytime. The glossary contains terms and definitions that will be used throughout the module. If, at any time during the module, you would like to review a term's definition, this glossary can be accessed on the upper left tab in the toolbar above this video on the page where the resources are. The public health approach includes 5 functional steps: surveillance, research on risk and protective factors, research on interventions, program and policy implementation, and evaluation and monitoring. All of the steps of the public health approach are necessary in order to successfully prevent injuries over time. This module will focus on the second stage of the public health approach, synthesizing the evidence of the risk and protective factors for injury. So what exactly are risk and protective factors? A risk factor is an attribute, characteristic, or exposure that increases the likelihood of injury. A protective factor is an attribute, characteristic, or exposure that decreases the likelihood of injury. Let's look at an example using drowning as the injury type. Evidence on risk and protective factors is necessary for the development of effective prevention strategies, and 2 types of information are needed. 1. Evidence of an association between a risk or protective factor and an injury outcome, and 2. Information on the prevalence of these factors in the target population. Consider the risk and protective factors from the previous activity. There is evidence of an association between the protective factor, wearing a life jacket, and a decreased risk of an injury outcome, drowning. So, developing a promotional campaign to encourage the use of life jackets seems logical, but will not be likely to result in any measurable impact on drowning injuries if the target population already has a high rate of life jacket use. Thus, in addition to evidence on the association between life jacket use and drowning outcomes, we also need to know the prevalence of life jacket use in the population in order to develop an effective prevention strategy. The resilience of the individual is also an important factor to consider when thinking about risk and protective factors for individuals. Some families and communities seem to demonstrate a resiliency to injury, regardless of the existence of factors that increase their risk for injury. For example, an individual or community that reports low socioeconomic status may not be at a higher risk for injury. Strong social supports, despite low incomes or few jobs in this case, may be protective factors. A child who has good self-esteem and receives consistent parenting does well in school, even though his caregivers have little education and income. We'll talk more about children's resiliency to injury later in the module. Risk and protective factors can be referred to as determinants of injury. Determinants describe factors that control or influence an outcome. A determinant can place an individual or community at greater or lesser risk for injury. While injuries are often attributed to the behaviors of individuals, they are actually the result of the interaction between individual, community, structural, and societal factors. Injuries do not affect all Canadians equally. Severe and fatal injuries are disproportionately experienced by individuals and populations who live in less affluent neighborhoods, have low socioeconomic status, and have low educational attainment. the likelihood of experiencing this type of injury declines as income level increases. This is Robin. Because of community, structural, and societal factors, Robin has a lack of access to resources and increased exposure to hazards. Robin's house was built with unsafe materials and is located in a low-resource neighborhood. Her family was unable to purchase products that can prevent injuries from occurring, such as baby gates, helmets, life jackets, and winter tires. As a result of social and material deprivation as a child, Robin developed a great deal of stress and had feelings of anxiety and sadness. This stress led to unhealthy coping mechanisms such as excessive alcohol use. As a result of many determinants, Robin is at a higher risk for both unintentional and intentional injury than those who have more access to resources and less exposure to hazards. The Public Health Agency of Canada has identified 12 key determinants of health. Several of the 12 are at play in Robin's story. Can you think of some of the determinants that are on the Public Health Agency of Canada's list? The key determinants include income and social class, social support networks, education and literacy, employment and working conditions, social environments, personal health practices and coping skills, healthy child development, biology and genetic endowment, health services, gender, and culture. The social determinants of injury are the economic and social conditions that influence injury risk in individuals and populations. In this module, we will discuss the following social determinants of injury in more detail: socioeconomic status, education, employment, social, physical, and built environments, healthy child development, gender, health services, and culture. Income and social status, or socioeconomic status, SES for short, is a person's positioning within social or economic hierarchies in society. Several studies conducted in Canada and worldwide have assessed the impact of wealth and social position on injury risk and experiences. Although a limited number of studies have demonstrated that injuries resulting from sport and recreation are associated with being from a higher SES group, lower SES has generally been associated with an increase in injury risk. Moreover, although injuries across all socioeconomic gradients have decreased over time, the strength of association between SES and injury risk has increased. This may suggest that some injury prevention activities are having a less pronounced impact in lower SES groups. This does not necessarily mean that injury prevention initiatives should target those with a lower SES group. Such an approach could result in some people, such as those with an average SES, being missed. Instead, the broader determinants of injury should be addressed with a continuing emphasis on underlying social and economic conditions that promote health and safety. In Robin's story, we heard that her family could not afford to purchase certain products that can prevent injuries from occurring. This is a common risk factor associated with being from a lower socioeconomic status. Being of a lower SES can result in inequitable access to safety promotion products such as helmets for use with bicycles, off-road vehicles, and other recreational equipment. In addition, levels of parental supervision can differ for children from different SES groups, and injury among children has been associated with unsafe, unsupervised use of heat sources, small appliances, playground and sports equipment, bicycles, ATVs, and so on. There may also be product safety-related associations between SES and injury at the neighborhood level, as communities of lower overall SES may not be able to afford or may not monitor the development and upkeep of the most up-to-date and modern safety equipment in parks, playgrounds, and other public spaces. The level of education a person completes is an important determinant of health and injury. Lower levels of education have been linked to lower health, greater stress, and lower self-confidence, whereas higher levels of education have been associated with improved employment, higher incomes, and improved health. Consider the following case study, then click on the link to browse the associated resources. Generally speaking, interventions designed to increase education and literacy levels will not be focused on reducing injury, but a reduction in injury would be a byproduct of such interventions. However, there are some interventions that can be implemented to deliver injury prevention education to high-risk populations. For example, an injury education program targeting families with low education levels with the goal to increase injury awareness and prevention. An example of one such program is the Canadian Child Injury Prevention Resource Program. This online tool provides resources designed for practitioners, as well as other public health workers, including child educators, daycare staff, or others working with caregivers, working in the Community Action Program for Children and Canada's Prenatal Nutrition Program. These practitioners identify the need for simple messages and images to use with families they serve, to teach them about preventing injuries in children. They also identify the need for training in the area of child injury prevention, particularly addressing the key determinants of health and how to influence behavior change. Employment is a central determinant of health. In most cases, it is directly linked to one of the most important social determinants of health, income. Employment also relates to injury through job characteristics, type of work, and working conditions. Lower paying jobs are often associated with poorer working conditions, more dangerous environments, and greater physical demands than jobs that are higher paying. In Canada, the most dangerous industries to work in are mining, forestry, fishing, agriculture, and construction. Another important factor relating to employment as a social determinant of injury is job security. Employees who are forced to take intermittent or precarious work have increased levels of stress and overall poorer health than those in permanent positions. They are also less likely to have healthcare benefits to supplement those covered under provincial healthcare. A number of recommendations related to reducing injury among workers have been suggested. Many of these relate to policy development. Policies should target high-risk jobs that are low-paying and under-regulated. Both the social environment and the built environment within the physical environment are key determinants of injury. We'll talk about the social environment first. Let's start by reviewing the eco-social model, a model that describes the relationship between the social environment and injuries. The eco-social approach suggests that the etiology of a health outcome, such as injury, involves complex interactions between individual, family factors, and the contextual nature of built and social environments in which people live, interact, and work. The model depicts injury as arising from an interactive process between individuals and their surrounding environment. According to the eco-social model, social factors can potentially impact injuries through social networks which operate at interpersonal levels and through social capital at the community level. So let's talk about these social factors in a little more detail. Social networks are characterized by relationships and interactions within a community or an organization. Most people integrate into society through their social networks, and this social integration is beneficial for their health. Social networks can influence health through social influence and social engagement. For example, behaviors associated with injuries can be reinforced when they are confirmed by peers, or discredited when disapproved by members of one's social network. Social capital is a complex social construct, and there is controversy over its definition and nature. Social capital is related to social networks, but it is a contextual phenomenon that operates at a higher level than social networks. Social capital is the presence of strong social bonds. Trust, informal social networks, and civic participations are the main components of social capital. Basically, it is the meshing of individual networks that create a whole social network, including the complete set of relationships between all participants in the network. Although there is not much evidence surrounding the relationship between social capital and injury, some studies have shown that social capital could play a protective role for certain health outcomes, including injuries, and that low social capital could be a risk factor for some injuries. Social norms generally define social organizations. In societies with low levels of social organizations, violent crimes and related injuries are more prevalent. Specific social norms may encourage or prevent behavior such as drug use, alcohol intake, and other high-risk activities that are related to injuries. So what does this all mean? Understanding the social factors that contribute to the occurrence of injuries may support prevention strategies recommended by health and social policy makers and program implementation teams. Social and behavioral factors can be modified by education, community capacity building strategies, and urban planning initiatives. Examples of injury prevention activities associated with social environmental factors might include peer education programs for high-risk behaviors and occupational health and safety campaigns that focus on building and leveraging stronger social environments at work. Consider the following case study to increase your understanding of the relationship between the social environment and injuries. Neighborhood Social Capital and Youth Injury. The objective of a study conducted by Elgar et al. 2010 on Canadian youth grades 6 to 10 was to examine whether adolescents' exposure to neighborhood social capital, which was defined as levels of trust, cohesion, and cooperation, reduces socioeconomic differences in physical and psychological health outcomes. Injury was among examined outcomes, and it appeared that social capital modifies effects of socioeconomic status on rates of injuries in this population. The study included 9,717 Canadian youths participating in the 2006 Health Behavior of School-Aged Children study. It was found that in areas of low social capital, higher levels of SES were associated with a decrease in the risks for injuries, whereas in areas with high social capital, having a better SES was associated with more injury. The increased risks for injury in areas with higher social capital among affluent youth may be due to increased participation in sports. Now let's talk about physical and built environments. The built environment refers to the man-made portion of the physical environment that provides the setting for human activities. It includes urban form, physical road infrastructure, land use patterns, and transportation systems. The built environment is a common risk factor that affects many health-related outcomes, including the risk of injury. Modifying the built environment can help to prevent many types of injury, including falls, drowning, and motor vehicle collisions. In this module, we'll examine the following settings in the built environment: housing, care settings, street design, rural environments, and outdoor play environments. Let's start with housing. The housing environment directly influences health, including the incidence of injuries. Research has identified a social gradient in housing and injury risk. That is, populations with low income and low educational attainment are at a higher risk of injury in the home. Causes of housing-related injuries include structural conditions from substandard housing, lack of safety equipment, low income, and chronic material deprivation conditions. Structural conditions in the home are associated with increased injury risk. These conditions include things like exposed heating areas, unsecured upper-story windows, low windowsill heights, slippery surfaces, and so on. Residents of high-rise buildings, especially children, are particularly susceptible to falls from windows, balconies, and faulty or steep stairs. In any home, lack of safety equipment, such as gates or handrails, can increase the risk of injury for seniors and children. In fact, the home environment is identified as a primary factor leading to unintentional injuries in children in low-income households. Next, we'll examine care settings. Long-term care, or LTC facilities, provide 24-hour professional supervision and care for individuals who have complex care needs and can no longer be cared for in their own homes or in an assisted living residence. The majority of LTC residents are older adults, aged 65 or higher, and typically have behavioral or cognitive problems or complex medical conditions. Hospitals have a more diverse patient population. However, older adults account for a high proportion of this population. The LTC environment is of particular concern to healthcare providers, as the rate of falls among LTC residents is 2 to 3 times that found among community-dwelling older adults, and approximately 30% of falls in LTC residents result in injury. Within care settings, many aspects of the built environment are associated with an individual's risk of falling and/or subsequent likelihood of injury in the event of a fall. Environmental interventions have been observed to reduce rates of falls in both long-term care and hospital settings. Let's review some specific examples. Flooring and transitions. When designing hospitals and LTC facilities, a common approach to minimize risk for falls is to use non-slip, non-glare, and even surface, with no inclines, steps or loose carpets, floors, and floor coverings. Fall mats. Another way to soften the landing of falls is to provide padding between the impact site, like the hip or head, and the landing surface, through the use of fall mats or bedside mats. Lighting. Older adults may experience changes in their vision as a part of the normal aging process and/or a function of disease. Proper lighting in care settings is therefore important to reduce the risk of falling for older adults with low vision, but also for the ease of all individuals navigating through the infrastructure. Clutter. Clutter is perhaps the most established environmental risk factor for falls, indicated mostly in trips and stumbles. To reduce clutter leading to falls, care settings should offer adequate space for storage of mobility aids and equipment. Handrails and grab bars. Care settings are also encouraged to incorporate handrails and grab bars to facilitate safe navigation and weight transfers, especially on and off toilets. Toileting aids. Toileting aids can help the user to function independently when using the toilet. Raised toilet seats, grab rails, toilet frames, and self-lift seats are all aids to assist with transferring on and off a toilet. Furniture. Interactions with furniture can lead to falls arising from a loss of external support or incorrect weight shifting. When designing furniture to prevent imbalance arising from loss of external support, there seems to be a need for automatic locking mechanisms, which cause mobile devices to become relatively immobile as soon as there is a transfer of weight. Aside from helping to prevent falls, furniture can also be designed to minimize the risk of injury in the event of a fall. Street design is an important aspect of built environments. In many countries, the primary consideration for street design has been motor vehicles, with less attention to pedestrian or cyclist safety. High-speed roads have been built in residential areas, while play and walking areas have been overlooked. Traditional road safety interventions have targeted individual road user behavior change, but these have not had impressive results. Built environment approaches focused on street design have more evidence supporting their efficacy. Almost half of the strategies promoted through Canada's Road Safety Strategy 2015 are directed at street design. Modification of the built environment, such as street design, shifts some of the responsibility from the individual and benefits the community as a whole. 3 important mitigation strategies are speed control, separation of motor vehicles from other road users, such as pedestrians and cyclists, and improved visibility of vulnerable road users. Although there is a promising evidence supporting the effectiveness of built environment street design interventions, there is a need for more well-controlled studies. In Canada, the rural environment is an especially important aspect of the physical environment. Canada is a vast country with 95% of its landmass considered rural, northern, or remote. Over 6 million Canadians live in rural areas, representing 19% of the Canadian population. Living in a rural environment poses unique challenges related to injury prevention due to different social, economic, and built environment conditions compared to urban areas. Injury, morbidity, and mortality is considerably higher in rural compared to urban areas. People living in rural communities generally need to travel longer distances and on more dangerous roads. Therefore, injuries and death due to motor vehicle collisions are much more common. Improved rural road conditions and raising road safety awareness need to be explored. Certain rural-based industries, such as farming, have high levels of occupational hazards, and attention to occupational health and safety issues specific to rural settings is important. There is a need for increased awareness and uptake of safety devices related to fire hazards and drownings in rural areas. Future research should explore whether conventional strategies, mostly developed by urban program planners for urban residents, are equally effective in rural settings. The final type of built environment we will explore in this module is outdoor play environments. Despite increasing evidence in support of challenging play, the balance of safety versus risk is an ongoing issue. In recent years, many playgrounds have been altered to improve safety, often resulting in the KFC playground comprised of a kit of play equipment, fence, and a carpet, usually rubber surfacing. The KFC playground has been criticized for offering little challenge and few natural elements. Providing children with play environments that change, give children the chance to create and imagine, and offer them not only physical but social and cognitive challenge is essential to healthy child development. Thinking beyond the KFC requires an approach to play design that aims to expand play opportunities rather than restrict them. Arranging natural materials to create spaces within the playground and placing materials in a way that encourages diverse interaction will inspire children to engage with their environment and learn from it. Flexible play spaces with a variety of diverse play opportunities allow children to determine the level and types of challenge they need to explore for their own developmental benefit. Creating versatile play environments that are inclusive of risks rather than averse to them will ultimately benefit children by teaching them to manage risk in their own environment. If you are interested in seeing 2 examples of how playgrounds were transformed from the KFC style to versatile play environments, click on the link provided and check out page 199. Access to health services is a key determinant of injury. In this module, we will focus primarily on access to trauma care. Minimizing the time between injury and trauma care improves outcomes. Prolonged discovery and transport times have both been identified as important variables contributing to these delays, and because they seem particularly relevant in rural environments, careful study of rural trauma victims is necessary to identify ways of improving access to trauma care. Evidence suggests that rural trauma victims experience worse outcomes compared to those in urban environments. Overall, persons injured in rural environments are nearly 50% more likely to experience a fatal outcome. Canada has particularly unique considerations for trauma care access due to its geographic variation, substantial landmass, and wide population distribution. Furthermore, as trauma systems are provincially administered in Canada, policy-based differences in access can occur. Defining which populations have reduced access to trauma care is an important consideration for policy related to improving the universality of trauma care for Canadians. Given the emergent nature of trauma and the fact that universal access to care is mandated, trauma has traditionally been thought to be devoid of racial biases. However, with many of its rural and remote communities largely inhabited by First Nations and Inuit peoples, race and spatial access to trauma care may be more relevant in Canada than previously thought. A recent meta-analysis examining racial disparities in trauma care in the United States demonstrated that non-white race and socioeconomic status were independent predictors of increased mortality following trauma. Canadian studies are needed to determine whether this also occurs within our system. Although recommendations for triage to a trauma center should be independent of race or gender, it is possible that unconscious biases affect access to trauma care for some patients. Gender is a very significant determinant of injury. For almost every kind of injury beyond 2 years of age, Canadian boys and men are 2 to 4 times more likely to sustain an injury than girls and women, and their injuries are more severe. The risk factors that contribute to increased injury risk for boys and men are not yet well understood. Lifestyle and personality characteristics, such as impulsivity, sensation-seeking, and risk-taking behavior, differences in socialization during childhood, attributions for how and why injuries happen, along with a variety of other factors have all been investigated with the goal of understanding why a strong gender discrepancy in injury exists. Although Canadian boys and men are far more likely to sustain an injury than girls and women at virtually any age, most injury prevention programs do not appear to be sensitive to these gender differences, and gender-based evaluations are typically not conducted. Although there are exceptions to this pattern of risk, such as the higher risk for self-harm in teen girls and LGBTQ youth, and fall-related injury in older female adults. More work needs to be done to take the higher risk for injury for men and boys into account, and to reduce the significantly higher rates of morbidity and mortality due to injury for both men and women across the life course. In this module, we will discuss culture as a social determinant of health by focusing on newcomers to Canada and Aboriginal populations. First, let's talk about injury prevention issues related to the growing and diverse immigrant population in Canada. Moving from one's native country to a new place is a stressful life event. This process often involves learning a new language and adjusting to a new environment. An individual's sense of community and cultural identity is radically altered by these changes. Dress codes. Food practices and social customs in the resettlement country can all differ, resulting in a cluster of stressors. Combined with challenging socioeconomic prospects, new immigrants tend to experience significant stress. In terms of how this experience is related to the rate of injury in the immigrant population, there is a scarcity of information about immigrant children's health, particularly as it relates to childhood injuries from falls, motor vehicle collisions, burns, and other causes of injury. Current data on injury rates in adult immigrants is limited, but suggests that adult immigrants, particularly men, are most likely to experience serious injury in the workplace. Many newcomer families lack information and knowledge about healthcare services generally, and injury prevention specifically. Culturally appropriate information would better connect families to appropriate healthcare and preventative services. This table summarizes some of the potential barriers and enablers to injury prevention among newcomers to Canada. As in the rest of Canada, injury is the leading cause of death for the Aboriginal population between the ages of 1 to 44. However, among Aboriginal peoples, injury rates are considerably higher. Moreover, First Nations people living on reserve and in northern communities have higher injury rates compared to other Canadians. A 2002-2003 study of First Nations children living on reserve estimated that 17.5% were injured compared with 12% living off reserve. The reasons for the differing injury rates and risks for injury among Aboriginal populations are complex. Societal factors, including health, educational, economic, and social policies, serve to maintain the economic and social inequality between many Aboriginal populations and their mainstream neighbors. Colonization, which affected language, culture, land rights, and self-determination, results in poverty, substandard housing, and overcrowding, inadequate water and sewer facilities, and barriers to education, all of which are recognized risk factors for injury. This pie chart depicts the leading causes of injury among Aboriginal people. Motor vehicle collisions. The high rates of motor vehicle crash deaths are most often attributed to the fact that Aboriginal communities are remote and isolated, road conditions are generally poor, and more hazardous machines such as all-terrain vehicles and snowmobiles are frequently used for transportation. In addition, when a collision occurs, emergency services and healthcare facilities are often hard to access. One study found that First Nations people are 5 times more likely to suffer severe trauma resulting from a motor vehicle collision compared to non-First Nations people. Other studies have shown seatbelt and child restraint use is lower in rural Aboriginal communities, resulting in a significantly increased risk of injury and death. Additional contributors to collision incidents include inadequate enforcement of restraint legislation, lack of helmet use with all-terrain vehicles, and substance abuse. Poisoning. Like other types of injury death, poisoning-related death seems to be more frequent among First Nations populations. In an early study in British Columbia, during the period 1991 to 1998, age-standardized mortality rates from poisoning were 4 times higher for First Nations peoples than for other BC residents. In a more recent study in the same province, covering the period 1992 to 2003, the rate of death from poisoning among First Nations were on average 4 times higher. A study conducted in the Sioux Lookout area suggested that accidental poisoning was prevalent in children under the age of 4. However, the rate for adults in this area was also high, primarily due to high rates of alcohol poisoning. Alcohol poisoning occurs when the amount of alcohol in the body exceeds tolerable limits. Toxic levels of alcohol can lead to death, either directly or by affecting judgment, coordination, balance, and reaction time. In British Columbia, where alcohol level was tested, nearly 90% of all First Nations injury deaths had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08% or higher. Suicide. Suicide accounts for roughly 1/4 of all Aboriginal injury deaths, with rates 3 to 4 times the Canadian average. Rates of suicide differ by geographical location and age. However, young First Nations and Inuit people are at significantly greater risk. Compared to overall Canadian rates, suicide in many Aboriginal communities and populations has continued to rise over the past decade. Although there are large variations across populations, the overall suicide rate among First Nations communities is approximately 2 to 4 times higher. Over 1/3 of all deaths among Aboriginal youth are attributable to suicide, and between the ages of 10 to 44, Aboriginal people on reserves are 5 to 6 times more likely to die of suicide than their peers in the general population. Fire and/or flame. Increased risk of death from fire in Aboriginal communities is due to a higher proportion of smokers in the home, wood-framed substandard housing, lack of working smoke detectors, increased travel times for fire rescue personnel and equipment, as well as shortage of trained firefighters. A previous study of First Nations communities in British Columbia demonstrated that injury fatalities due to fire were 8 times higher than the provincial average. First Nations children are particularly vulnerable, where studies in Manitoba report children are 5 times more likely to die in a house fire, and that some 31% of fire deaths in Aboriginal populations occurred in children between 1 and 14 years of age, compared with 16% in the general Canadian population. Drowning. In 1996, drowning in the Aboriginal population was 6 times higher than the Canadian average, with rates in children as much as 15 times higher. While Aboriginal peoples comprise about 4% of the Canadian population, they account for approximately 26% of drowning cases that involve a snowmobile, 16% of drowning cases after a fall into water, 10% of people who drown during recreational aquatic activities, and 9% of those who drowned related to boating activities. Aboriginal people are at increased risk of drowning because of proximity to open bodies of water, low use of flotation devices, and alcohol use. It is reported that only 6% of Indigenous drowning victims were wearing a personal flotation device. Alcohol use is also reported as a significant factor in drowning deaths. Healthy child development is an important social determinant of injury, as injuries are a leading cause of disability and death of children in Canada. To complement a public health approach to this problem, practitioners and researchers in injury prevention have begun to consider how a human rights framework might be used to support their work on child injuries. They have done this by specifically exploring how the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or UNCRC, might guide their ongoing studies of the problem as well as interventions in the field. For example, the 2008 World Report on Child Injury Prevention specifically references the UNCRC in defining the responsibilities that countries across the world have toward children with respect to unintentional injuries. Here is a summary list of some of the key UNCRC articles related to child injuries. The UNCRC, as a legally binding international agreement, is a powerful tool for upholding the rights of children. It provides a framework for decision-making, advocacy, and monitoring, while setting standards against which to assess and improve the treatment and well-being of young people. In the introduction to this module, you'll learn that injury resiliency is an important feature to consider when thinking about risk and protective factors for individuals, and that some families and communities seem to demonstrate a resiliency to injury regardless of the existence of factors that increase their risk for injury. Injury resilience is a complex social, medical, and community process. Resilience is the ability to transform adversity into a growth experience and move forward. Resilience can be thought of as a measure of the ability of an organism to adapt and to withstand challenges to its stability. Resilience is a positive trait, process, characteristic, or observation. Resilience can minimize injury impact for the injured person or persons and their communities. There are 10 key steps for maximizing injury resilience. Key steps for maximizing injury resilience. 1. Facilitate healthy and connected early life experiences to maximize brain elasticity and adaptability. This includes assisting community efforts to reduce negative child experiences, such as child abuse and neglect. Positive early childhood experiences pay large dividends to individuals and society. 2. Acknowledge that injury will and does occur in all parts of the life cycle. 3. Recognize the injured person brings their personal life experiences, knowledge, and fears to this point in their life. Their resilience capacity is impacted by past experiences and the context of their current injury. 4. Empower individuals and communities with knowledge and skills to deal with the immediate physical and psychological needs of the injury. 5. Engage the care team needed to surround the injured person with positive effort. 6. Seek opportunity and innovative options to recover and grow from this injury experience. 7. Encourage self-control, self-management, and self-esteem, elevation through community partnership and support. Avoid individual and cultures of learned helplessness. 8. Encourage a positive mental health and support and treat mental stress and illness. 9. Encourage early recognition of comorbid conditions that would benefit from acknowledgement and treatment. 10. Engage in further research on injury resilience principles, education, and application in all parts of the life cycle and all communities. The prevention of unintentional injuries to children and adolescents differs substantially from that of adults for two main reasons. First, patterns and susceptibilities to injuries change as children and adolescents grow due to physical, cognitive, psychomotor, and behavioral development. Second, children and adolescents' physical and psychological characteristics make them more vulnerable to injuries. Consequently, strategies to prevent unintentional injuries in adults cannot be directly translated to children and adolescents, and must consider differences in injury vulnerabilities across developmental stages. This chart shows the leading causes of unintentional injury hospitalization for Canadian children 0 to 19 years old. As you can see, the causes of unintentional injuries among children and adolescents vary by age due to multiple factors such as child development and exposure to hazards. The prevention of unintentional pediatric injuries requires considerations that are unique to children and adolescents. Children and adolescents are more susceptible to injuries than adults because of their stature or because their bodies, bones, muscles, skin, and brains are developing. Moreover, children and adolescents' vulnerability to certain types of injuries changes as they grow and engage in different activities in different places and within different social contexts. For this reason, strategies to prevent injuries vary by developmental stage. Finally, many strategies are targeted at caregivers to encourage changes in their behavior or the environment around children. In this module, we explore the economic and social conditions that contribute to injury risk. You should now be able to differentiate between risk and protective factors. Identify key determinants of injury. Understand how social determinants of health affect injury risk. Be aware of the concept of resiliency, and be able to identify populations that have a higher injury risk. Below, you will find a few resources if you are interested in learning more about data methods, interpretation, and surveillance. There are 2 parts to complete the evaluation of this module. The first part is intended to assess if you have shifted your readiness to tackle surveillance. The first question asks you how you felt before you began the module, and how you feel now that you have completed the module. The second question is about behavior change. The second part of the evaluation of this module is a feedback form. This feedback form will help us to improve the quality of this module. Please click on the link in the question panel to complete the survey.